The courtroom smelled of old wood and lemon polish. Photographs of past judges lined the walls. Reporters sat in the back, phones poised. A hush settled as she walked in, a young black woman, shoulders squared, notebook under her arm. She wore a simple dress and an expression that balanced exhaustion with unbending purpose. They had called her arrogant and a liar. None of those names explained why she had spent 7 years studying languages in borrowed books, on late-night bus rides, in community centers, and in the quiet light of dawn at kitchen tables while the city slept. "Do you understand English?" the judge asked. "Yes," she answered. "State your name for the record." His gavel hovered. She gave it. He turned to the case. Fraud, elder abuse, a contested signature. The courthouse fed on small cruelties packed into legal jargon until they looked like facts. The defense attorney began to cross-examine a widower who spoke slow, stitched English. Pieces emerged: a power of attorney, a transfer of funds, a handwritten note in a language no clerk could read. "They'll say the note is meaningless," she told the woman who had hired her to translate. "I'll show you it's a map." The woman whispered, "I can't go to court. They'll shame me and my mother." The young woman had taken the case because she believed words mattered, and people deserved someone who would learn to speak for them. When the note was presented, the judge squinted at the looping characters. The clerk tried dictionaries and an online translator. Nothing reliable came up. "Does anyone here speak this language?" the judge asked, as if expecting a miracle. She stood. "I do," she said. Heads turned. The judge's eyebrows lifted. Standing felt like stepping onto a bridge, while the current tugged at the planks. Her palms were steady from years of practice. "Please approach the bench," the judge said, amusement in his voice. He likely expected an accent or a novelty. The defense attorney's smile widened. The prosecutor watched with a mix of interest and curiosity. She took the note with gloves and placed it under a lamp. She read it slowly, eyes moving like a cartographer reading a coastline. The language unfolded in her mouth with intimate correctness. She translated tone as well as words, preserving tenderness and small anger in the writer's voice. The judge laughed once, short and condescending. People say all sorts of things in court to gain sympathy. He expected performance. She kept translating. She explained the script was an older form, that phrasing placed imperative on a witness, that an ink blot was a flourish common in letters written by caretakers who feared being watched. Her fingers traced stroke order as if mapping a path. "The note states the power of attorney was to be invoked only in a medical emergency," she said. "It names a local pastor as witness and asks that money be used for necessary care, not long-term investments or transfers to third parties." The courtroom grew quiet. The widower's face shifted from defeat to alarm. The defense attorney pressed, suggesting regional dialects created ambiguity. She replied that dialects existed, but there were anchors, particles, and honorifics that couldn't be shuffled without changing meaning. "Do you speak 9 languages?" the judge asked with a half-smile, as if the claim were entertainment. "9," she answered, "and a handful of dialects." He sounded surprised that youth and knowledge could sit together. She could have told him about nights studying after double shifts at the diner, and weekends in church basements where immigrants taught each other tongues. Instead, she explained plainly how languages work like keys, and how a single misread word could hinge a life. The prosecutor asked about credentials. She had no university diploma in translation. She had experience. She had translated birth records in 3 countries, volunteered at shelters, and worked with elders who spoke like hymns. She offered certificates from community classes and letters from pastors. The courtroom respected paper. The judge nodded but remained cautious. "Proceed with your translation for the record," he said. She translated and narrated the life of the woman who wrote the note, a woman who had grown up on a coast where sharing was survival, who had watched neighbors lose savings during hospital stays, who wrote with careful hands so money meant care, not exploitation. The widow's hands trembled as if feeling the letters like a bomb. When she reached a line naming the pastor, she paused. "Why a pastor?" the judge asked. "Because she trusted him," she said. "He was literate when she wasn't and would ensure wishes were respected. It's trust, not a loophole." The judge made a small note. He had been taught to find loopholes. He had not been taught how a community's web of trust looked from inside. The defense called an expert linguist who testified that phrases could be double-read. The expert's voice had academic distance that made the widower flinch. Language can be slippery, he said. Not to people who speak it every day, she replied. It has rules and customer uses that carry legal weight. My translation is based on those uses and on comparisons with similar documents I've seen. She offered examples from funeral registries and savings agreements. The judge's expression shifted like a curtain drawing. He asked precise questions about syntax and regional markers, about the ink's age and the paper's texture. She explained stroke pressure, the singular hand that wrote the note, and why it did not read like a forger's hurried work. Inside, the drama unfolded in small details: a particle that signified consent, an honorific that constrained a power of attorney. With each clarification, the story tilted from theft to a vulnerable woman trying to preserve dignity in illness. At the translation's end, she folded her hands. The note was never intended to transfer wealth out of the family, she said. It was a stopgap to ensure care if the principal could not write. The named pastor and wording make that clear. The widower seemed to breathe for the first time in months. Silence. The defense requested a recess, a small procedural move that belied a larger recalibration. The prosecutor looked at her with new respect. The judge, who had laughed earlier, now watched as if she'd performed revelation. When the courtroom emptied, a woman from the back asked, "How did you learn this language?" "My grandmother taught me pieces," she said. "Then neighbors, then churches. I listened a lot." She did not romanticize struggle. She learned from necessity. People think language is a trophy. For me, it's a way to be useful. The woman nodded, tears gathering. Days later, the prosecution adjusted charges and sought mediation. The defendant agreed to return funds to a trust overseen by a neutral party, and the court ordered oversight and counseling. The widow hugged the translator. In a hallway, gratitude tumbling out in a dialect that made them laugh and cry, the translator accepted the embrace with quiet dignity. Word spread in immigrant circles, church basements, and laundromats. People brought letters, healthcare forms, and contested notes. She became a bridge, someone who could help a son understand his mother's last wishes or verify a deed scribbled in a pamphlet. Not everything was smooth. Responsibility weighed heavy. Clients expected miracles. Judges doubted. Colleagues asked about formal credentials. But there were small triumphs. An uncle reading his wife's testament, a child reunited, a clinic discharging a patient because consent forms were properly translated. A retired United Nations translator once told her, "You don't need a piece of paper to say you are a translator. The work itself is your credential." It landed like a gift. She kept it for days when doubt pressed like rain. The judge reflected, too. He began consulting community organizations more often and asking clerks to be open-minded about witnesses who didn't fit expectations. His laughter that day became a lesson. Assumptions can be costly. Months later, the elderly woman moved closer to her church. The translator visited with tea and stories. They read letters, corrected a soup recipe, and argued about where to store spices. The widower joked, sometimes in English, sometimes in the old language, that the court had been saved by a miracle worker who spoke in 9 tongues. The phrase spread online. People loved the number because it sounded cinematic. Some headlines favored spectacle over story. The young woman found the truth quieter. She used languages so people could be heard. She used her skills to untangle lives knotted by illness, distance, and error. At a small community ceremony, she received a modest plaque. Neighbors told stories: a lost birth certificate found, a pension successfully claimed, a will correctly interpreted. The plaque read, "For service to community." She thought of the judge's laugh and was grateful it had taught someone to listen. Years later, in another courtroom, a younger judge who had read the old docket smiled when he recognized her. He didn't laugh. He asked questions with respect. She translated with the same steady patience, because translation is the slow work of listening first and deciding later. There were nights she rehearsed pronunciations in front of a mirror, shaping lips around syllables that felt foreign to her own bones. She had a system: start with greetings, move to numbers and kinship terms, then to phrases about health and food, words that mattered in the conversations people actually had. She learned to recognize when a speaker's voice tightened at a particular consonant, when a vowel haloed into softness. She learned the cultural weight of silence, how a pause could be a polite refusal as heavy as a full sentence. Her bilingual friends sometimes joked that she had a romantic relationship with tongues. Others called her pragmatic. To the families she helped, she was something closer to kin. A mother who had once believed her daughter's medical directive meant incarceration of assets instead found her daughter's wishes honored because the translator persuaded a reluctant administrator to read a phrase the right way. A teenager who had been told to sign papers he did not understand sat, trembling until the translator explained what each clause truly meant. In court, tensions rose when the defense attorney, sensing crack in his case, tried to paint her as an amateur, someone who read tone into emptiness. He raised questions meant to poke holes had she considered that a similar word in a neighboring dialect meant something else. Was she not projecting meaning where none existed? He suggested that emotion could color a translation, that a compassionate reading might tilt evidence. She answered each objection with the exactness of someone accustomed to being doubted. She cited parallel documents, explained how certain particles were unambiguous, and recited examples from her files. When he brought up an alternate translation, she demonstrated on the page why that reading would invert the writer's intent. The judge, whose laugh had marked the opening of the day, now watched with a face that bore the careful crease of someone re-evaluating assumptions. The turning point came when she requested that the court allow her to call the pastor named in the note. The defense protested that it was irrelevant, then flailed when the pastor spoke on record. He testified that the writer had indeed entrusted him with the duty to witness medical decisions when the writer could not speak for herself. He described their long friendship and how he had been present at the bedside when medicine and prayer braided together. That testimony was a hinge, the kind of human detail that changes the shape of paper into a life. Outside, cameras hummed and editors prepared headlines that would later be too quick to fit the full story. Inside, the widower's voice. When he described his late wife's manner of folding letters like origami, added texture to the document the translator had revealed. The jury, given time to ponder, returned with instructions that reflected the court's new understanding, a settlement plan, oversight for the son's access to funds, and restitution where appropriate. It was not a grand vindication, but it was enough to keep a life intact where it might have been dismantled. Afterward, reporters chased the simpler angle. A young woman who spoke 9 languages had left a judge speechless. They asked about family, about schooling, about whether she planned to monetize her skill with YouTube videos or a consultancy. She deflected most of it. "I want people to be heard," she said. "The rest is noise." But she did begin to take more intentional steps, offering pro bono hours at a legal clinic, teaching classes at a community center, and building a small practice that respected those who could least afford to be misunderstood. Not everyone approved. A few in the legal community grumbled about amateurs stepping into expert roles. Some worried that passion alone was not a substitute for formal accreditation. There were nights when she sat awake worrying about a missed nuance, replaying a phrase until it sounded foreign even to her ears. She learned through those restless nights to ask for corroboration when necessary, to bring in formal linguists when a case required academic authority, and to keep meticulous notes that could stand up in court. Meanwhile, the community's gratitude found other forms. A church organized a fundraiser to help with the expenses of translations for people who could not afford them. A local lawyer offered to mentor her on courtroom procedure. Neighbors brought meals. A baker from down the block created a small cake with "Thank you" written in 3 scripts, and the widower sent a note with a photograph of his late wife smiling in sunlight, a small document of human truth. She began to travel less by impulse and more with purpose. When agencies from other cities called, asking for help with elderly clients who wrote in old alphabets, she agreed on terms that balanced service and sustainability. It was work that required empathy and stamina. She listens.